Before the war, the city was neither architecturally remarkable nor strategically important. It was not a capital, not a major port, not a center of weapons production. It existed like hundreds of other small towns, quietly, steadily, almost unnoticed by history. And precisely for that reason, its fate would later become especially revealing. Each morning began the same way. The baker opened his shop before sunrise. The milkman moved along the street, leaving glass bottles on doorsteps. And at 7:30, the school bell rang. Its metallic, slightly sharp tone carried across the districts, and could be heard almost everywhere. Children walked along the cobblestone streets. There were many of them. So many that small bottlenecks of satchels and scarves formed at intersections. The younger ones clung to each other so they would not fall behind. The older ones walked faster, arguing about a book they had read or about who would solve a math problem better. The girls carried notebooks tied with ribbon. The boys sometimes hid pieces of chalk or smooth stones from the river in their pockets. The school stood on a hill. A two-story building with wide windows through which morning light poured. Inside, it smelled of wood, chalk and ink. The floors creaked but were solid. The library contained books collected by several generations of teachers. Each classroom held 30, sometimes 35, students. During breaks, the corridors filled with a steady hum. In the yard beneath an old maple tree, children played ball, jumped rope, read aloud. Teachers knew every child by name. They knew who struggled to see from the back row, who was afraid of loud noises, who dreamed of becoming an engineer and building bridges over the river. Their future felt like a natural continuation of the present. When the first newspaper reports of rising conflict appeared, the city treated them as distant concerns. People discussed them at the market, in lines, in workshops. But the school continued its routine. The first mobilization lists were posted in the spring. Men read them silently. Some smiled at their children when saying goodbye, promising to return before the next school year. In classrooms, empty spaces began to appear at parent meetings. Graduation photographs grew smaller. Fewer fathers stood behind the rows of students. The children did not yet grasp the scale of what was happening. To them, it seemed like a temporary absence. But teachers saw more. They noticed changes in the tone of essays. In assignments about the future, there was less lightness. Words such as, if, when it ends, and, after they return, began to appear. In autumn, the first siren sounded. The noise was unfamiliar, sharp, alien. It tore through the morning calm and forced the children into silence. Teachers quickly led their classes to the basement. It was cramped and cold. The children sat close together, holding their school bags, listening to distant, muffled impacts. That first bombing caused little physical damage. But something shifted. Airplanes began appearing in drawings. Shelter games replaced ordinary play. During recess, the children discussed rumors about the front. Within weeks, the strikes became more frequent. First, windows shattered in a nearby building. Then a warehouse by the railway was hit. The school remained standing, but cracks began to form along its walls. Classrooms grew colder. Potbelly stoves were installed for the winter. Children wrote while wearing fingerless gloves. Some families began to leave. Parents sent younger children to relatives in villages. Empty desks appeared in classrooms. Teachers did not remove them. They left textbooks and notebooks in place, as if the students were merely late. Winter brought intensified raids. One shell struck a residential block. Several civilians were killed, among them a third-grade student. The next day, an empty chair was placed in his classroom. No one spoke openly about what had happened, but the children looked at that chair longer than usual. Gradually, the school began to change its purpose. One classroom was turned into a medical storage room. Another held food supplies. Teachers continued to conduct lessons, but air raid alarms interrupted them more and more often. Some subjects were cancelled entirely. The library suffered during one of the bombings. The blast wave shattered the windows, and part of the collection caught fire. Teachers and older students extinguished the flames together. They carried salvaged volumes into the yard. Many books were lost forever. But the most noticeable change was not structural. The children's voices grew quieter. There was no running during breaks anymore. Games disappeared. Conversations became shorter. Teenagers began helping adults, carrying water, unloading crates, assisting at the hospital. It became clear then, the war was no longer approaching. It had entered the city. In the spring, an order arrived for the mandatory evacuation of younger students. Parents packed hastily. Teachers compiled lists late into the night. Bundles of clothing and boxes of documents lined the corridors. On the last day of classes, the principal gathered the students in the hall. He spoke of temporary separation, of reopening the school, of knowledge that could not be destroyed. The children listened in silence. The next day, the bell did not ring. The railway platform was overcrowded. The freight wagons were cold, unheated. Mothers embraced their children too tightly. Teachers counted names again and again. The train began to move. And for the first time, the city heard silence. The teenagers who remained watched until the train disappeared around the bend. They did not know that many of those who had left would never return. They did not know that their own fate would soon be uncertain. The school closed a week later. The building still stood. The maple tree in the yard was still green. In one classroom, the date of the last lesson remained written on the board. But the city had already begun to lose something more than walls. It had begun to lose its age. And that would become its deepest loss. Evacuation did not begin with calm organization. It began with fear. At first, families who had relatives in the countryside sent their children away quietly. Then others followed. By the time the official order arrived, the city had already understood that waiting too long could mean not leaving at all. Lists were compiled at night under dim kerosene lamps. Teachers moved from house to house, knocking on doors, confirming ages, checking documents, marking names in their notebooks. Ready, refused, ill. Each entry was written carefully. Each line represented not just a child, but a future. At dawn, an old freight train pulled into the station. There were no proper passenger cars, only wooden wagons with rough plank floors. Chalk marks on the sides indicated the intended destination, a distant region considered safer. The platform filled quickly. Mothers stood tightly packed together, holding children by the shoulders, by their coats, by their hands. Some children had paper tags pinned to their clothing with their names written in ink. The younger ones did not understand why they were being separated. The older ones pretended they did. Teachers stood nearby with their lists, counting again and again. A miscount meant disappearance, not only in reality, but in the record of existence. When the train began to move, the platform erupted in movement. Women ran alongside the wagons for as long as they could. Some tried to keep pace until the steam and smoke swallowed the cars. The sound of metal wheels on rails grew fainter, then vanished. For the first time since the war began, the city felt empty in a different way. At first, news trickled in. Several trains had reached their destinations. Children were distributed among rural schools, farms, and temporary dormitories. They worked in fields, learned in overcrowded classrooms, adjusted to unfamiliar accents and unfamiliar faces. But not all reports were clear. Some railway lines were damaged. Certain trains were rerouted. One convoy was delayed for nearly a full day at a small junction after an air raid destroyed part of the track. Records later showed that several wagons were hit. The exact number of casualties was never fully confirmed. Documentation had burned, and chaos left gaps no archive could fill. Back in the city, a separate file was opened in the municipal archive. Evacuated. Letters began to arrive weeks later, irregularly, unpredictably. They described farm work, cold dormitories, hunger, attempts at continuing lessons. Some children wrote that they had not heard from their parents. Some letters returned with a stamp. Address no longer valid. Meanwhile, those who remained in the city, the teenagers, entered a different phase of the war. There were fewer of them than the year before. But they became essential. The school building officially lost its educational function. One classroom stored medical supplies. Another became a ration depot. The gymnasium turned into a temporary hospital ward. Teenagers worked alongside nurses. They boiled instruments, carried stretchers, delivered water, and read letters to wounded soldiers who could no longer hold paper steady. Many of them saw injuries that no child should ever witness. No one spoke openly about the psychological cost. There was no vocabulary for it yet. Food shortages deepened. Bread was rationed by carts. Lines formed before sunrise. Teenagers unloaded supply trains when they arrived, repaired broken fences, collected scrap metal for war production. Education faded into the background. Survival became the curriculum. Winter intensified the strain. Malnutrition weakened immune systems. Infectious diseases spread quickly in overcrowded shelters. Medicine was scarce and prioritized for military use. Several adolescents died from complications that would have been treatable in peacetime. Their funerals were small, almost administrative. By early spring, the municipal council attempted to estimate demographic changes. Internal calculations showed that the population aged 10 to 16 had decreased dramatically, through evacuation, death, illness, and disappearance. But even these numbers were incomplete. During one concentrated bombing raid, a residential block was destroyed. Entire families vanished. In the registry, a brief note appeared. Household eliminated. That phrase meant more than a statistic. It meant the erasure of lineage, parents, children, and the possibility of continuation. Communication with evacuated children became even rarer as the front shifted. Some letters stopped arriving altogether. Others described worsening conditions. A few mentioned that local authorities could no longer confirm the location of certain groups. As the war dragged on, some of the remaining teenage boys reached conscription age. A number volunteered or were drafted into service. Their names would later appear engraved on a memorial plaque. By the time the fighting neared its end, the city's transitional generation, those who should have been finishing school, had almost disappeared. The school building stood damaged but upright. The roof leaked. Windows were boarded. In one classroom, the date of the last lesson still remained faintly visible on the chalkboard. When military operations moved elsewhere and the city was no longer on the front line, an official population audit began. The results were stark. Out of approximately 300 pre-war students, fewer than 100 were physically present in the city. The rest were evacuated, deceased, missing, or permanently displaced. More troubling than the number was the distribution. There was a visible gap where an entire age group should have been. Those who should have been 14 or 15 at that moment were almost entirely absent. This was not just a temporary loss. It was structural. The city had not only lost people. It had lost a step in its generational ladder. Even if every surviving child returned, even if reconstruction began immediately, the continuity had already been broken. Buildings could be repaired. Windows could be replaced. But the natural progression from child to adolescent to adult had been interrupted. And that interruption would shape the city long after the war itself had ended. When the war finally ended, the city did not celebrate immediately. There were no spontaneous parades, no sudden return to laughter. What arrived first was exhaustion and silence. Not the tense silence of waiting for sirens, but a different kind, the quiet that follows when there is nothing left to destroy. People began to return. Demobilized soldiers stepped off trains thinner and older than their years. Families emerged from evacuation routes, carrying bundles, documents, and stories of survival. The city administration reopened its offices and began the methodical task of counting who remained. The first comprehensive post-war census was not just a bureaucratic exercise. It was an inventory of absence. Clerks compared pre-war school registers with current population lists. They cross-referenced parish books, hospital records, and ration card archives. Names that once filled entire pages now stood isolated. Entire columns were marked with annotations. Deceased, missing, unconfirmed. Of the roughly 300 students enrolled before the war, fewer than half could be accounted for within the city limits. And even among those listed as alive, some were scattered across distant regions, unlikely to return. But the most striking discovery was not numerical, it was structural. There was a visible void between childhood and adulthood. The cohort that should have been in late adolescence, those who would now be entering universities, apprenticeships, marriages, was drastically reduced. In certain birth years, the number of survivors was so small that an entire graduating class could fit into a single row of desks. The school was repaired as a priority. The roof was reinforced with new beams. Broken walls were plastered. Windows were replaced with uneven panes of glass salvaged from surrounding districts. The bell was rehung in its tower. On the first day it rang again, the sound echoed differently. The yard felt too large for the number of children gathered there. Teachers stood with attendance books in their hands, reading names into open air. Some surnames were never answered. Inside, the classrooms seemed wider than before. It was not the architecture that had changed. It was the absence of bodies. Teachers reopened the old registers. The handwriting from years earlier appeared almost naive, confident, steady, unaware of interruption. Next to many names, new notes were written in softer pencil, as if unwilling to press too hard on finality. Killed in bombing. Died in evacuation. No record of return. Within 5 years, the consequences extended beyond the school walls. The first post-war graduating classes were small, sometimes fewer than a dozen students. There were not enough young adults to fill apprenticeships. Factories lacked trainees. The hospitals struggled to recruit local nurses and doctors in training. Weddings became rare events. Photographs from the late 1940s show modest ceremonies with limited attendance. The number of young couples was simply too low. A demographic chain reaction had begun. Fewer young adults meant fewer births. A decade after the war, municipal statistics revealed a deep trough in the birth rate corresponding precisely to the missing generation. The absence of teenagers during the war had translated into an absence of parents afterward. Sociologists would later describe such patterns as demographic collapse or generational discontinuity. But for residents, it manifested in quieter ways. Certain streets had no children playing. Certain houses remained occupied only by the elderly. Some family names disappeared from local directories entirely. The archive room in the municipal building became an unintended memorial. Stacks of documents recorded interrupted lives. Personal files ended abruptly in 1943 or 1944. School essays about future ambitions lay folded beside official death notifications. One preserved composition described plans to build a new bridge across the river. The author had been 14 when he wrote it. The bridge would eventually be constructed by engineers from another region. The city rebuilt physically. A new park replaced a cratered lot. Residential blocks rose where ruins once stood. The facade of the town hall was restored. In photographs taken 15 years after the war, the skyline appears stable again. Yet when demographic charts were drawn, a gap remained. Birth years corresponding to wartime adolescence formed a hollow in the population pyramid. It was not temporary, it was permanent. No policy could retroactively create those missing years. Even as new children were born in the 1950s, the imbalance persisted. There were too few middle-aged adults to support rapid growth. Economic expansion lagged behind neighboring towns that had preserved larger portions of their youth. Former students occasionally returned to visit. They stood in front of the school, now renovated, and searched for familiar features: the old maple tree, the staircase, the classroom windows. Many struggled to recall all the faces from their childhood photographs. Memory, like population, had thinned. In the school hallway, 2 framed class photos hung side by side. One from before the war, crowded, energetic, full. The other from the late 1940s, sparse, composed, restrained. Between them lay the rupture. The bell continued to ring each morning. New generations filled the desks. Laughter eventually returned to the yard. But it did not erase the structural absence embedded in the city's history. Because war does not only destroy buildings. It interrupts continuity. It removes a segment of time, an age, and leaves a hollow that reverberates through decades. The city survived. Its walls were rebuilt. Its streets repaved. Its institutions restored. But somewhere in its demographic memory, there remains a silent space, the place where a generation should have stood. A city can reconstruct architecture. It cannot reconstruct childhood once it has been erased. And that is why this place would always be remembered not for what was bombed, but for who never grew up.